Greetings, this is Andy Johnson. I'm one of the founders and facilitators of the International Literacy Educators Coalition. It is my joy to introduce our guest today, Dr. Elena Aydarova. And all I'm going to say about her is she has written two of what I think are seminal articles for helping us understand the science of reading. Whatever you want to call it, Science of Reading Mythologies in the Educational Reform Movement, 2023, Harvard Educational Review. And what you see is not what you get. Science of Reading Reforms is a guise for standardized centralization, and privatization. American Journal of Education, 2024. So with that, I will be quiet and let us introduce Dr. Aydarova.
Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you so much for joining and listening to the webinar. Again, my name is Elena Aydarova. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I will be talking about science reading and the educational reform movement, focusing specifically on actors, networks, and agendas. To give you a sense of the talk, I'll set the context first. I'll talk about the definitions that folks use when they talk about the science of reading. I'll spend the bulk of my time actually looking at the policy roots of science of reading reforms. I'll contextualize those in the broader policy networks that circulate reform agendas, and then return to the question of what is it that is hidden behind the science of reading movement. So first, the context. Most folks are aware or became aware of science of reading when Emily Hanford began reporting about the kind of challenges that some students experience in schools. And in her podcast, she made the claim that some children are struggling with reading because teachers don't know the science of reading, and they don't know the science of reading because they were not taught the science of reading in the colleges of education where they were trained. What we saw over the last decade truly is a number of states picking up fairly similar reform packages. By 2023, we had 39 states that have passed some version of science of reading bills. Now, most folks, when they think about science of reading reforms, they tend to think about curriculum adoption or perhaps the introduction of screening assessments. Sometimes people think about the new requirements to notify parents or for teachers to take professional development or teacher candidates having to take teacher licensure tests that are specifically rooted in reading. But the reality is that these bills actually have a lot more packed in them. They include measures like coaching support for teachers, very specific guidelines for what constitutes high quality instructional materials, as well as, the requirement that schools use decodable books, provide tutoring, offer summer camps, make sure that they have interventions for struggling readers. And in many states, not all, but quite frequently, there's also the third grade retention component that says that children cannot proceed to the fourth grade unless they pass the reading, the standardized reading assessment at the end of third grade. So that's a lot that actually happens in the policy space around science of reading. Now, the point that we want to consider is not just what is happening, but also who is involved in these policies. And the way I have approached this question is actually by exploring the involvement of conservative organizations. So how conservative think tanks or policy institutes or even advocacy groups like Moms for Liberty have pushed for the adoption of science of reading reforms. And looking at it from that angle, I was able to trace out several different agendas that become entangled in science of reading reforms and their offshoots. For some of you who are in literacy spaces, this will be familiar. It's the Scarborough rope that is increasingly used in professional development and teacher education courses. And I've renamed some of the strands to kind of pull out the agendas that become entangled together, such as curriculum reform, centralization and standardization, as well as privatization. So with that, one thing that I want to focus on for a second is different definitions that people provide, because we can understand some of the reforms better if we understand how people think about what is it that they're talking about. Emily Hanford frequently explains that science of reading refers to a body of research in psychology, neuroscience, and focuses on the biological basis of reading. However, that definition is not universal. So think tanks like National Council on Teacher Quality based in DC and Excel in Ed, based in technically Florida, but influential across the country, actually call science of reading the big five: phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And if you just compare those first two, you'll see that they're not quite the same thing. The big five were actually frequently talked about even before this wave of science of reading reform. So for me, this kind of definition always raised this uncomfortable question: why is it that this is being treated as something new, as if this has not been something that was a part of what schools have been doing for a while? Well, someone else has another interesting definition, and that's Kareem Weaver, known as an activist in California, but again, influential across the country, who talks about science of reading as science of reading, evidence-based teaching, this and that. You can call it whatever you want to. And this is something that I've also encountered in policy contexts where I've done my research, where people will frequently refer to it as whatever you want to call it. As long as it meets the agendas that I'm pursuing, or it helps me get to the place where I want to get to, you know, this works. I'm going to call it the science of reading. So with this muddy type of situation with how people define science of reading in ways that is not necessarily consistent across policy context, the next thing that is worth paying attention to, and what I will focus on in the bulk of my talk, is actually the policy roots. Where is this reform coming from? And what I've discovered is actually its beginnings are in the Reading First component of No Child Left Behind Act, particularly its version in the state of Florida, where the state embarked on the reforms of reading when Jeb Bush was the governor. And one of the key components of the reform in Florida was actually the social promotion ban. So the third grade retention was the key cornerstone of the reform there. Jeb Bush, after he stepped down as a governor, started an organization known as Foundation for Excellence in Education, or Excel in Ed. It's a policy think tank that has been bringing together educational reformers since 2008. And it's two organizations in one. One is a nonprofit that provides model bills and helps states with their adoption. And the second one is actually a lobbying group. They've divided the country into regions, and each region has a representative where they lobby for the kind of bills and reforms that Excel in Ed promotes. Excel in Ed receives funding from big foundations that are known for fairly conservative agendas, as well as from corporate actors. So, for example, Amplify or Lexia are both for-profit entities that have been very influential with the products that they claim are aligned with the science of reading, that are being increasingly adopted and used across the country. So they are among the funders for Excel in Ed gatherings and Excel in Ed events. Just to clarify that, Excel in Ed pursues a wide range of reforms, but most of them kind of fill within the buckets of what some refer to as disruptive educational reforms. and that is the focus on the introduction of charter schools, support for vouchers for private schools, and alternative routes into teaching. So science of reading becomes a part of a much broader set of agendas. When ExcelenEd has its summits, this is one example from 2019, it is often bringing in legislators and officials and policymakers from state contexts, from actually all 50 states, as well as non-profit actors, philanthropies, and other reform-oriented organizations that are very influential in shaping agendas. So you have state actors interacting with philanthropy and nonprofit sectors, and very little interaction with academics or researchers who are studying these processes. ExcelenEd has been working on model policies for a while, and the one that they have promoted has been the comprehensive reading policy. This is a version that was available publicly in 2014 that has many of the measures that we can recognize from what's being implemented now, including third grade retention, intensive development in phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary, as well as other measures. And this point about the intensive development in these particular 5 areas aligns with how ExcelenEd actually defines what science of reading is about, partly because that's what they have been doing for over a decade already. ExcelenEd is a member of the organization that is known as ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. Colleagues who have investigated how ALEC influences educational policies refer to it as corporate bill mill, which means that they tend to design bills that favor business interests, that support privatization efforts, as well as more conservative agendas more broadly. ALEC brings together, again, state lawmakers, as well as corporate members and conservative think tanks. So ExcelenEd is part of that organization, and ALEC actually did put out a bill that focused on literacy that was developed by ExcelenEd and adopted that bill for circulation in 2011. That bill talked about, again, social promotion, identifying struggling readers, notifying parents, giving students state-identified reading curriculum, and providing struggling readers with scientifically research-based reading instruction. That literacy bill was a part of a much broader omnibus bill that looked at vouchers, that promoted alternative teacher certification, and again, other agendas that both ExcelenEd and ALEC tried to push through in educational policies. That is why when we look at the adoption of science of reading bills, we can see that even though Emily Hanford's reporting started around 2018 on this topic, there have already been other states that implemented these measures and implemented these bills before. And even though it is common in the media to focus on the state of Mississippi, there were other states like South Carolina and North Carolina where similar measures, and Michigan, where similar measures were introduced, but actually did not produce positive results. And in fact, in Michigan, researchers who conducted work there pointed out that third grade retention caused a lot of harm, as we would expect based on what we know in the literature. Back to the membership, ExcelenEd is a part of ALEC, along with what used to be called Wireless Generation and then became Amplify, the company that produces science of reading materials, curriculum, as well as professional development, as well as now testing, as well as other organizations that are known for their influences on educational policies, such as Fordham Institute, Goldwater Institute, Pioneer Institute, Texas Public Policy Foundation. Because these are all members of ALEC, they would receive the bills that ALEC adopts for circulation, and they would take those bills to their state legislators, asking them to introduce those bills. But ALEC has a sister organization called State Policy Network. State Policy Network brings together around 68 conservative and libertarian think tanks across the country. Each state has at least one or two or more such think tanks. And those think tanks also partner with ExcelenEd. ExcelenEd is a partner of State Policy Network. And these think tanks themselves lobby for science of reading in their own contexts. So in the state of Wisconsin, one of the earlier versions of the bill was introduced by the Institute for Reforming Government, a conservative think tank that partnered with Decoding Dyslexia and used the model bill that ExcelenEd designed to claim that if it was passed, it would improve reading achievement in the state. And something similar happened in Kentucky with Bluegrass Institute. There they partnered actually with the Department of Education and pushed for the adoption of this bill in their context. So what's important to understand about this particular network is that it includes corporate actors or private providers, along with conservative think tanks that have different ways to leverage their resources and influence policymaking circles, sometimes through direct lobbying and introduction of bills, or getting legislators to introduce the bills that they're interested in, and sometimes through policy reports, newsletters, blog posts, podcasts, and other means that they have available at their disposal. ExcelenEd always updates its policy. So I've already shared 3 versions of it, one from 2011 that ALEC adopted, another one from 2014 that was available through ExcelenEd website directly. And this version is from 2020, where you can already see much more clearly highlighted the focus on high quality instructional materials, parental notification, coaching for teachers, as well, again, the 3rd grade retention based on reading scores. And you can see that these bills come neatly packaged in such a way that it would be very easy for legislators to just take the text provided by the organization, modify it slightly, and then adapt it for their own context for easy introduction for consideration and deliberation. And this is where we want to kind of focus a little bit on ExcelenEd and think about how they think about their work. So from the interview with one of the policy fellows in the organization, I learned how they think about what they're doing. So this is somebody who is specifically involved in literacy policy work, who shared that ExcelenEd has a C4 organization, right? So the lobbying arm that consists of advocacy team members who can lobby in state, who can work directly with legislators, who may say, I want to champion an early literacy law. This person serves as a policy expert in early literacy. They have 2 team members, and what they do is they review bill language, provide feedback on whether the language is meeting the best practice standard, and they also provide language on how the bills can be strengthened. Then they testify in the committees. They travel to make sure that they can attend some of those meetings when they're held. And in 2022 alone, they work directly with 15 states. They work with states that are passing laws, adopting laws, trying to amend laws, trying to protect laws. And in addition to working with legislators and policymakers, they also work with stakeholders and coalitions. So if there's an advocacy organization, again, for example, as Decoding Dyslexia or another group that is interested in pushing for science of reading bills, ExcelenEd will come along and work with those advocacy organizations to help them meet their goals. And they say they are a one-stop shop for all things policy support, which means that they work not only with the conceptualization of these policies, but also with their implementation. So this person continues, we call ourselves a think tank and a do tank because the other side of the work is the implementation side. Once the law is passed, then I work with my team to support state education agency staff, who now are responsible for making sure that all of these things that are written actually come into being. We provide implementation support to state agencies. We do have what's called an early literacy network, and that network currently has 28 states. We meet with them quarterly, twice virtually, twice in person, provide individual technical assistance, looking at implementation and supporting those states as they're engaging in this work. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to see what this network work looks like, but Excellent Ed produced an implementation guide where they laid out how states need to be thinking about what it means to implement science of reading bills, and whether stated directly or indirectly are actually products produced by the private entities, corporate entities, for-profit entities that have supported this work all along. So on the list are Lexia, Amplify, Open Up Resources, and Great Minds. And partly because of this entanglement between private sector actors and these reforms, one of the participants in my study, an activist in California, talked about how when people hear the science of reading, they imagine a little trademark symbol brought to you by the science of reading. Right. And certainly the involvement of these organizations points to why this would be the case. Now, moving on, I want to talk about the networks that are mobilized in delivering and providing support for the implementation of science of reading reforms. And to get to this, I'll take a step back and actually look at the state of Tennessee. It was not one of the early adopters like Mississippi, but they still passed their Literacy Success Act in 2021. And Penny Schwinn, who at that time was the Commissioner of Education in Tennessee, was invited to share at one of the Science of Reading summits her success story. How is it that they managed to build the kind of coalition that allowed the Science of Reading bill to be passed? And she shared with the audience that was attending that summit that it was knowledge matters, that there were influencers who came to the state and talked to teachers and really raised the voice of educators. They used media outlets like the 74 Million, and it was Knowledge Matters campaign that talked about early reading, high quality instructional materials, and really provided the support for making sure that that legislators would be willing to pass the bill. So what is this Knowledge Matters campaign? It was actually started by Robert Pondisio in 2015. And Robert Pondisio describes himself as a Hirschian, meaning a follower of E.D. Hirsch. Robert Pondisio believes that core knowledge is what will save democracy in the United States and provide equity in schools. And so he calls himself a core knowledge disciple. He worked for the Core Knowledge Foundation that E.D. Hirsch started, but he has also spent quite a bit of time as a policy fellow, both at the Fordham Institute and at the American Enterprise Institute, promoting the conservative reform agenda that I've mentioned before. The current person in charge of the campaign describes it as a PR firm or a marketing firm for a category. Emily Hanford's work matters, but it's more that they are managing to take advantage of the kind of energy that her podcasts created to promote a particular category. And the category that they promote is knowledge building curricula. Knowledge Matters campaign was taken over by the organization Standards Work that was created to design and implement Common Core State Standards. They received funding from Charles Koch Foundation, and using that funding, they started the national school tour of the Knowledge Matters campaign. And that national school tour involved going around different states and talking about the successes of implementing particular knowledge building curricula in schools and really amplifying the stories of success. The founder of Standards Work, in a newsletter for Fordham Institute in 2018, wrote about the science of reading movement as an opportunity for curriculum renaissance, a way that could push the country to transition to curricula that are created by smaller organizations, newcomers on the textbook market, that received all green reviews on ed reports. And the way it worked is that the publishers or the producers of the curricula donated money to Standards Work so that they would engage in this Knowledge Matters campaign and the traveling and production tied to it, that then would highlight the curricula that these publishers produce. That's how CKLA, Wit and Wisdom, and EL, for example, have been highlighted as exceptionally successful curricula across 24 articles, for example, in 74, as well as in other media outlets that focus on educational issues. Knowledge Matters also has provided a review tool, a curriculum review tool that some states have adopted as a tool to help them figure out what should be used in schools after the state passes science of reading. However, the irony of all of this is that on the review tool that they publicly display, they actually say how it does not focus on foundational skills, meaning all of those conversations about phonics and phonemic awareness are not the things that they're concerned about, because they really do care only about knowledge building, and they promote the curriculum that focuses on knowledge building. And for example, Wit and Wisdom, designed by great minds, does not have the foundational skills component at all. So its alignment with science of reading is only possible if it is bundled together with other more phonics-based curricula. The reality is that it is really only about knowledge building. Now, focusing a little bit more on the specific curriculum, and that is core knowledge language arts, it has quite an interesting history. It was developed by E.D. Hirsch, who is well known across the country for writing in 1986, 1987, the book called Cultural Literacy, where he made a claim that for Americans to sustain the democracy, they all should have access to the same knowledge. They should all know the same facts. And from that list of the facts that he thought that all Americans should know emerged core knowledge sequence. Right? So the kind of topics that elementary schools should cover to prepare all Americans to participate in the democratic processes. He established Core Knowledge Foundation to promote these ideas and to advocate for knowledge building in English language arts classrooms. Core knowledge sequence was implemented across a variety of schools, and over time was developed into core knowledge language arts curriculum in early, actually second half of 2000s. It became a much more scripted, a much more tight curriculum that Fordham Foundation and Manhattan Institute both really appreciated and really promoted as the kind of curriculum that would equalize opportunity for children for different backgrounds. Core knowledge language arts was acquired by News Corp that started Amplify by acquiring Wireless Generation. Joel Klein stepped down from his position as the Chancellor of Education in New York City and took on the position in Amplify. And when things did not go well at Amplify and News Corp decided to sell it, Emerson Collective acquired it along with A+ Ventures, two venture philanthropies that are involved, again, in the disruptive educational reform movement. Arnie Duncan sits on the board of directors for Emerson Collective, and Margaret Spellings, who used to be the Secretary of Education under Bush Jr., sits on the board of directive of Amplify itself. So as you can see, there is an entanglement both of business interests and venture philanthropies, as well as political actors that the public in the United States tend to see as coming from different political camps. Yet what they have in common is their service on the board of directors of the organizations that are deriving quite a bit of profit from the crisis that is being created around literacy. Back to Hirsch, his vision for core knowledge language arts actually coincided with his vision for a national curriculum. He had long argued that the United States is not doing well on international assessments because it does not have the same curriculum implemented across the states. And when the Common Core state standards were being developed and introduced, he supported them because he saw that his curriculum, CKLA, would align well, and Common Core state standards would allow his curriculum to rise to the level of the national curriculum. He also made the argument that the problem in schools is that multicultural education produces achievement gaps because it teaches children from historically underserved communities that they're victims. A very problematic understanding of how inequality is produced in the US society and how inequities are reproduced in schools. He also laid progressive education, that there are achievement gaps because children do not get direct instruction, which produces knowledge deficit. And again, part of this package is to say knowledge building would address that and equalize opportunity for all children. So this vision of equity, as Marilyn Cochran-Smith would say, thin equity, gets translated into CKLA as a curriculum based on direct instruction, scripted teaching, tight sequencing of topics that may or may not be of interest to students. Core knowledge sequence was critiqued heavily for its Eurocentric focus, and quite a few teachers find CKLA also problematic because of its depictions of historically underrepresented groups that remain quite problematic. But the argument from the reformers and from Hirsch himself remains that core knowledge language arts should be a common curriculum to ensure equality and to give students access to the same curriculum so that they would feel a sense of patriotism and allegiance to this country. Now, when we think about this in policy context, when Tennessee, for example, was going through ELA textbook adoption that was, again, aligned to the science of reading principles, more than half of the materials that districts ended up adopting came from the list that was provided by Knowledge Matters campaign. So Amplify showed up, Great Minds showed up, Learn Zinnian showed up, Open Up Resources showed up. In Alabama, when they also went through a textbook adoption process after the Literacy Act was passed in 2019, the task force that was looking at curricula identified 2 that could be implemented in alignment with science of reading. But in the end, because of technical difficulties, only Amplify was allowed to be adopted across the states. In Alabama, that created a backlash, but ironically, the backlash was the opposite of how it is perceived in other contexts, because in Alabama, it was conservative families that showed up and said that CKLA is too progressive to be used in Alabama schools. So there was quite a bit of pushback there. The state superintendent ended up backing off and allowing districts to choose other materials as well. But nevertheless, what's important about this case is the way in which the effort to monopolize the market becomes very clear in those adoption processes. And that's what we see happening across contexts, that CKLA is one of the most common, most frequently approved curriculum package across the states that pass science of reading bills. We see it show up in various contexts across the country. So it's not quite yet a national curriculum, but you can certainly see the work that it is being done to get it there. And that work is set in motion by these networks that bring together nonprofits that advocate for knowledge building curricula, as well as think tanks like Fordham, American Enterprise Institute, Manhattan Institute, that continue pushing for these knowledge building curricula and very problematic notions of equity baked into them, as well as for-profit actors, right, like Amplify, as well as Great Minds that produce curricula and circulate those curricula through the support of the think tanks that are invested in the messages included in those curricula. And we see here also the philanthropic organizations that are supporting this work and making this possible. Now, to the agendas, the last part of my presentation, there's several different strands that we can identify. And certainly one of the important elements that has to be acknowledged is the ways in which the curricula that are being promoted, such as CQLA, are tangled up in the agendas of Christian nationalism. Hillsdale College, an ultra-conservative Christian college in Michigan that has its own charter school network, actually used core knowledge sequence as the foundation for its own curriculum, and they're great admirers of Hirsch's work. In Texas, after the science of reading was introduced in 2019, there were additional bills, and in particular in 2023, House Bill 1645, that focused on open educational resources, but was known among legislators as Amplify Bill. And what that bill did once passed was use core knowledge language arts as the foundation for open educational resources that the state would provide that then were infused even more with Christian content. So now public schools, homeschools, and other educational institutions can access for free curriculum that was conservative to start with and has been made even more Christian as a result of these reforms. There is also another strand of agendas that are tied into the science of reading reform movement. And to look more closely into those agendas, I'll focus on the Council of Chief State School Officers. So CCSSO is a membership organization. They bring together chief state school officers from across the state to discuss what needs to be happening in education. And in February 2020, right before the pandemic started, they actually organized a literacy summit that was focused on the science of reading. And as the organizer acknowledged during the opening, during one of the sessions, is that all the major publishers were present in the room. After the summit, they issued policy recommendations that were promoting science of reading measures similar to what Excel had done in the past. Now, I have a colleague who used to work for CSSO, and he refers to this organization as pay to play, meaning its activities are heavily supported by private sector actors that get a lot of revenue from the educational market. And among the funders of CSSO activities are Amplify, Great Minds, and Cambium that owns Lexium, as well as other organizations that again provide materials, assessments, resources for the implementation of science of reading. So those funders are supporting the work that CSSO is doing. Back to the summit. So in 2020, Literacy Summit focused on the science of reading. One of the longest sessions was actually dedicated to high quality instructional materials. And one of the key speakers during that session was David Steiner. David Steiner currently is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, but he has sat on the board of Core Knowledge Foundation, was involved with Knowledge Matters campaign that I've already described as a fellow with American Enterprise Institute and was an advisor to National Council on Teacher Quality. So he has had multiple roles in the networks that have been involved in the curriculum reform as well as in the science of reading reform most recently. So in his presentation at CSSSO, he is addressing a comment that was raised by one of the superintendents earlier who felt that it was un-American for the state level Department of Education to dictate to districts what they should be doing and how they should be making decisions. So this superintendent is sharing a concern that they're getting this message about centralization of power and they really don't feel comfortable with this message. And in response, David Steiner gives a set of strategies. And those strategies are telling that, departments of education should really limit the choices of curriculum. They should prepare teachers to only teach that curriculum. That when they evaluate teachers, the questions should ask the specific questions about the curriculum that was chosen, such as core knowledge or written wisdom. Professional development should be centered on that curriculum. Assessment should be tied to that curriculum. And procurement should be designed in such a way, procurement policy should be designed in such a way that districts would not pursue other materials, but only pursue what the state has chosen. So again, superintendent had concerns about the centralization of power, and David Steiner offered all of these strategies, how it actually should be accomplished, and more, right? Among the attendees, sitting right next to David Steiner, in fact, was Robert Pandisio, who I already mentioned before. He participated in the summit, offered his comments, but after the summit, he wrote in a newsletter that American Enterprise Institute circulates among the conservative education reform network. And in that newsletter, Robert Pandisio said that it is time for the conservatives to really take advantage of the science of reading movement to support common curriculum and make sure that teacher training and licensure strategy are all aligned to that curriculum. That notion became known as the virtuous circle, meaning that, the reforms are introduced in such a way that they're interlocking with each other and are setting kind of the same agenda together. So whatever incentives exist for adopting the highest rated programs feed into the specific curriculum that gets chosen and implemented. That curriculum is assigned to as aligned to diagnostic and screening assessments, aligned to professional development, teacher training, and reading licensure. Again, much greater standardization. And if you think about the Department of Ed playing a much greater role in setting parameters for all of those things, it is also much greater centralization of power at the state level. These ideas about these principles as being interlocking and that they should be pursued in tandem with each other also showed up at State Policy Network conversations. And just to remind you, State Policy Network brings together over 68 conservative and libertarian think tanks across the country. And so among those folks, the conversation has been that the schools are really problematic, and schools of education particularly because of equity, diversity, inclusion agendas they pursue, because DEI from their perspective is radical indoctrination and left-leaning radicalism. And so in State Policy Network context, the conversation has been that if you just get the teachers to focus only on content, they won't be doing any of those other things. And most recently at their meeting, Robert Pandisio shared how core knowledge language arts really meets all the criteria of what they hope to see in schools, and again should be implemented as a common curriculum to improve educational quality and to educate citizens to be loyal to this country and to its ideals. So that was one of the strands of the agendas. And then finally, an important element, of course, in all of this is profits. Based on the reforms that have been introduced, for example, the companies that support the organizations that promote these reforms are standing to gain profits. Amplify offers core knowledge language arts that I've discussed extensively, but it also offers professional development aligned with it. It also has screening tests. Most recently, I think they acquired Dibbles as well. And they now have a system of parental notification that they've trademarked that they call Home Connect. And so if all of these are written into the bills as their new requirements, Amplify already has all products that will be aligned with the bill requirements. We don't have public data about how much their profits have increased most recently, but even before the major wave of science of reading reforms hit, they already saw massive rises in their profits. And what's interesting is that in the middle of 2010, so 2015, 2016, business schools used Amplify as an example of a failing venture because they've taken on too many products and were not successful in the market. And what science of reading reform has done, and particularly Amplify's connections to Excel and Ed, CCSSO, as well as ALEC, what it has allowed them to do is come around from a failing venture that was going bankrupt to being a very successful enterprise. And again, Larry Berger, who is now the CEO of Amplify, was a member of ALEC Education Task Force when the earlier versions of the bill were discussed. So what I've discussed today was the ways in which multiple agendas get tangled up in the science of reading reform movement, and those include curriculum reform, growing centralization and standardization of educational policies and practices, the connection with social promotion bans, as well as the privatization of instructional core. There's a lot more to talk about, but that will have to be discussed some other day. In conclusion, what I want to highlight is that it's really important to understand that science of reading, as it plays out in policy context, is largely a performance. It's less about science itself. It's much more about particular policy packages that focus on standardizing curricula, focus on centralizing power, removing local control, or really making local control very limited, as well as privatization, right? Reliance on private actors to provide all the services and products that would support the implementation. And because of the products that are being chosen, but also actors that are involved in this, equity becomes redefined as the same inputs. Right, so it's not about attending to the needs and unique needs that students bring from their communities or from their own backgrounds, but it's more about giving everybody the same curriculum and expecting that if students receive the same curriculum, they will be able to succeed. Largely, these reforms are also about the rewriting of the social contract, because now instead of protecting the most vulnerable, the new bills and laws end up protecting the private sector and their profits. And finally, the way these bills have been introduced and the way in which dissenting voices have been quite violently put down, including on social media, point to the way in which science of reading becomes a part of this movement to introduce a lot more authoritarian forms of governance in educational institutions and educational contexts. So this is it from me. If you have any questions, comments, or observations, please feel free to email me. And my work is available on my professional website. This and other publications are all there available for you if you're interested in learning more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I do have some questions. First, how does this movie end? And I know that's a tough one to ask, but how does this movie end?
That's a fantastic question. I think the only answer I can give is it depends. And I think largely it depends on the ability of educators, parents, um, activists, um, to see first that science of reading is not about science. And that if it is about privatization and disruption, um, and standardization and centralization of power, then we need to really build coalitions and find ways to fight back the broader movement that is destroying public schools, right? Because again, what's important about this analysis is this connection of science of reading bills with the activities of organizations such as ALEC and ExcelinEd and SBN that have been determined, set on making sure that public schools are eliminated. Because for those organizations, public schools are government bureaucracies that are failing. So they don't see them as spaces where we can cultivate democratic ideals and learn to communicate across difference and learn to define our shared futures. They see public schools as institutions that should be dismantled, and parents should be given the right to choose, including to use state money to send their kids to private schools. These are all problematic ideas that we all need to be fighting. And, because science of reading is a part of these agendas, we have to figure out how to build coalitions to fight back.
Here's another question or statement. The science of reading is built on the idea that experimental and quasi-experimental research is used to isolate variables to determine causality. But yet these groups seem to be randomly assigning causality. It's DEI that's impacting education, and randomly assigning cures for the mythological reading crisis. How are they able to look themselves in the mirror and be randomly assigning causality?
Well, I think part of the answer in actually lies in separating out, right? Um, I have separating actors and the kind of evidentiary base they're using in constructing their arguments. I had a chance to attend one of the science that was organized by the Reading League. And one of the panels that they put together was the panel of scientists, neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, who are conducting research in the science of reading. And what was fascinating for me about that panel is that folks who were invited to speak said things like, we have to be very careful about what we observe in the lab and the kind of assumptions we're making about how these observations in the lab, where we can control a lot of the environment, then travel into contexts where we can't actually control anything, right? And so, like that was a very thoughtful critique of, no, you actually can't take these findings too far. You have to be very careful, acknowledging that contextual factors matter. Someone else on that panel, like Marianne Wolf, for example, stood up and said, why do we have to fight, right? Like, why can't we have a dialogue and find ways in which we can create the kind of knowledge base that will serve all students? And, that was a really beautiful statement, except the non-scientists are the people who will come in and say, oh, I'll keep talking about wars because that's what's good for marketing, right? Or they will say things like wars are really useful to get people energized and fighting with each other, right? So you can get a lot out of creating conflict. And in the conservative circles, there's actually a term that they use. It's conflict entrepreneur, like somebody who intentionally creates conflict to get people fighting, to get their agenda across. And so then back to the causality, I think, then switching in how conservative groups think about these issues, I think it's really important to remember that many of the claims that are made are not necessarily made because there is evidence supporting them, right? The fact that, Hirsch, for example, claims that multicultural education is what makes students feel like victims, there's no research that actually would show that.
Mhm.
But the way conservative think tanks operate, and I think this is really important for folks to remember, is they find ways in which they can package the message in a way that would emotionally resonate, right? Like it's almost like finding the words that that average person would hear and say, oh, this is how I would say it, right? Without giving them a chance to think, wait, is this backed by evidence? Has anyone studied this? Has this been established by any empirical studies? Um, and so that's where they can make all sorts of outrageous claims because they operate in this space that Stephen Colbert first, and then actually anthropologists of policy have called truthiness. Right?
Yes.
Like it sounds like it's kind of like truth, and I kind of like it, and so I'm going to repeat it. And then it doesn't matter if it's actually true or not, right? Which is very problematic. And again, in anthropology of policy, and here I really appreciate the work of Janine Waddell, who actually started this work early on when the US was considering invading Iraq. And so she documents how these neoconservative networks create these policy messages that are not rooted in evidence, as we know what happened in 2002, right? But instead are kind of really packaged in this emotional language that really pulls the strings and, with the message of urgentness, right? Like urgency, right? It like leaves no space for people to question, challenge, or move away from that. So I appreciate you asking this. And I think we really need to remember that many of these claims in the policy context. And that's again, I want to emphasize, I'm not questioning or challenge the science, actually. Like what people say and study and write in scientific studies is interesting, useful, and important. We should read it, we should learn it. But in policy context, it's a very different story.
Last thing, one of the definitions included of science of reading identified basic research versus applied research. Now, Shanahan says that science of reading should be identified as only that applied research that has been proven in a classroom context. So here is that schism between basic and applied, and it sounds like the science of reading, or that definition, was based on basic research, which is important. But as you said, the difference between basic and applied, and I'll be quiet.
Yeah, and like really honestly, I pull those definitions to show the disconnect between them. Um, and, I think to a degree, what Emily Hanford says is related to the work that Mark Seidenberg did, who I think made that kind of point about basic research, lab research. And I think it's deeply unfortunate that in this moment, so many different knowledge paradigms are being excluded. And here, what I want to say that it's not just about what counts as research that is problematic, but also whose knowledge and whose voice matters in policy deliberations. And in particular, I think it's deeply troubling that students of color, children of color, communities that have seen major divestment of resources are constructed as problems that need to be addressed. And yet, their voices and their knowledge and their understanding of literacy and how their children need to access literacy is completely not brought into those conversations. So, my invitation to folks in this space is to be thinking about how we can create shared understandings amongst ourselves and how we can ensure that we're not just discussing what constitutes science or not, but also who matters, whose humanity matters, whose knowledge matters, and how we can work together to amplify the voices of those who have been silenced in the process. Not just scholars, but also communities that are, again, suffering intensely because of the reforms that are being introduced, not only in the educational context, but also more broadly in social sphere.
Oh my goodness. Why, thank you, Dr. Aydarova. You have helped me understand, helped us understand, and provided a broad context. So I appreciate it very much.
And actually, can I quickly do a short little plug? I'm working on an edited issue of Bank Street College Occasional Papers on Science of Reading with Paul Thomas, and we're thinking about bringing in voices of folks who have been sidelined and silenced. So if anybody who watches might be interested in writing something, particular teachers or activists, folks who come from historically underrepresented communities who are affected by these, we would love to hear your voices and get them included in the special issue.
And those are the voices that are being silenced, the teachers, the parents, the communities of color.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.